On this video, I'm going to continue reading from Ralph Waldo Emerson's collection of essays. Please feel free to share your thoughts, your insights, your comments, your feedback. Let me know what you think of the ideas I'm sharing in these essays written by the amazing one and only Ralph Waldo Emerson. And what do you think of my style of reading? Does it resonate with you? I want to hear all about it. Please like or dislike this video and smash the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Hope you're having a great day. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me as I read this amazing book. Here we go. Just gonna pull that up a little bit. Okay, a little less. Okay. Indian relics abound in Concord. Throw heads, stone chisels, pestles, and fragments of pottery. And on the riverbank, large heaps of clamshells and ashes mark spots which the savages frequented. These in every circumstance touching the Indian were important in his eyes. His visit to Maine were chiefly for love of the Indian. He had the satisfaction of seeing the manufacture of the bark canoe, as well as of trying his hand in its management on the rapids. He was inquisitive about the making of the stone arrowhead, and in his last days changed a youth setting out for the Rocky Mountains to find an Indian who could tell him that, quote, it was well worth a visit to California to learn it, end quote. Occasionally, a small party of Penobscot Indians would visit Concord and pitch their tents for a few weeks in summer on the riverbank. He failed not to make acquaintance with the best of them, though he well knew that asking questions of Indians is like catechizing beavers and rabbits. In his last visit to Maine, he had great satisfaction from Joseph Pullis, an intelligent Indian of Old Town, who was his guide for some weeks. He was equally interested in every natural fact. The depth of his perception found likeness of law throughout nature, and I know not any genius who so swiftly inferred universal law from the single fact. He was no pedant of a department. His eye was open to beauty, and his ear to music. He found these not in rare conditions, but wheresoever he went. He thought of the best of music was in single strains. And he found poetic suggestion in the humming of the telegraph wire. His poetry might be bad or good. He no doubt wanted a lyric facility, and technical skill, but he had the source of poetry and his spiritual perception. He was a good reader and critic, and his judgment on poetry was the ground of it. He could not be deceived as to the presence or absence of the poetic element in any composition, and his thirst for this made him negligent and perhaps scornful of superficial graces. He would pass by many delicate rhythms, but he would have detected every live stanza or line in a volume, and knew very well where to find an equal poetic charm in prose. He was so enamored of the spiritual beauty that he held all actual written poems in every light esteem in their comparison. He admired Aeschylus and Pindar, but when someone was commending them, he said that Aeschylus and the Greeks, in describing Apollo and Orpheus, had given no song or no good one. Quote, they ought not to have moved trees, but to have chanted to the gods, such a hymn as would have sung all their old ideas out of their heads and new ones in, end quote. His own verses are often rude and defective. The gold is not yet run pure. It is drossy and crude. The thyme and marjoram are not yet honey. But if you want lyric fineness and technical merits, if he had not the poetic temperament, he never lacks a casual thought, showing that his genius was better than his talent. He knew the worth of the imagination for the uplifting and consolation of human life, and liked to throw every thought into a symbol. The fact you tell is of no value, but only the impression. For this reason, his presence was poetic, always piqued the curiosity to know more deeply the secrets of his mind. He had many reserves and unwillingness to exhibit to profane eyes what was still sacred in his own, and knew well how to throw a poetic veil over his experience. All readers of Walden will remember his mythical record of his disappointments. Quotes, I long ago lost a hound, a bay horse, and a turtle dove, and am still on their trail. Many other travelers I have spoken concerning them, describing their tracks and what calls they answer to. I have met one or two who have heard the hound and the tramp of the horse, and even seen the dove disappear behind a cloud, and they seemed as anxious to recover them as if they had lost them themselves. End quote. His riddles were worth the reading, and I confide that if at any time I do not understand the expression, it is just yet. Such was the wealth of his truth, that it was not worth his while to use words in vain. His poem entitled, quote, Sympathy, end quote, reveals the tenderness under that triple steel of stoicism, and the intellectual subtlety it would animate. His classic poem on, quote, Smoke, end quote, suggests Simonides, but is better than any poem of Simonides. His biography is in his verses. His habitual thought makes all his poetry a hymn to the cause of causes, the spirit which vivifies and controls his own. Quote, I hearing get, who had but ears and sight, who had but eyes before. I moments live, who live but years, and truth discern, who know but learning's lore. End quote. And still more in these religious lines. Quote, now chiefly in my natal hour, and only now my prime of life, I will not doubt the love untold, which not my worth nor want have bought, which wooed me young and woos me old, and to this evening hath me brought. End quote. Let me repeat that. Quote, now chiefly in my natal hour, and only now in my prime of life, I will not doubt the love untold, which not my worth nor want have bought, which wooed me young and woos me old, and to this evening hath me brought. End quote. Whilst he used in his writings a certain petulance of remark in reference to churches or churchmen, he was a person of a rare, tender, and absolute religion, a person incapable of any profanation, but by act or by thought. Of course, the same isolation which belonged to his original thinking and living detached him from the social religious forms. This is neither to be censored nor regretted. Aristotle long ago explained it when he said, quote, one who surpasses his fellow citizens in virtue is no longer a part of a city. Their law is not for him, since he is a law to himself. End quote. Thoreau was sincerity itself, and might fortify the convictions of prophets in the ethical laws by his holy living. It was an affirmative experience which refused to be set aside. A truth speaker he, capable of the most deep and strict conversation, a physician to the wounds of any soul, a friend knowing not only the secret of friendship, but almost worshipped by those few persons who resorted to him as their confessor and prophet, and knew the deep value of his mind and great heart. He thought that without religion or devotion of some kind, nothing great was ever accomplished, and he thought that the bigoted sectarian had better bear this in mind. His virtues, of course, sometimes ran into extremes. It was easy to trace to the inexorable demand and all for act truth, that austerity which made this willing hermit more solitary even than he wished, himself a perfect probity. He required not less of others. He had a disgust at crime, and no worldly success would cover it. He detected paltering as readily in dignified and prosperous persons as in beggars, and with equal scorn. Such dangerous frankness was in his dealing that his admirers called him, quote, a terrible Thoreau, end quote, as if he spoke when silent, and was still present when he had departed. I think the severity of his ideal interfered to deprive him of a healthy sufficiency of human society. The habit of a realist to find things the reverse of their appearance inclined him to put every statement in a paradox. A certain habit of antagonism defaced his earlier writings. A trick of rhetoric not quite outgrown in his later, or of substituting for the obvious word and thought its diametrical opposite. He praised wild mountains and winter forests for their domestic air. In snow and ice he would find sultriness, and commended the wilderness for resembling Rome and Paris. It was so dry that you might call it wet. End quote. The tendency to magnify the moment, to read all the laws of nature in the one object, one combination under your eye, is of course comic to those who do not share the philosopher's perception of identity. To him there was no such thing as size. The pond was a small ocean, the Atlantic a large Walden pond. He referred every minute every minute fact to cosmical laws. Though he meant to be just, he seemed haunted by a certain chronic assumption that the science of the day pretended completeness. And he had just found out that the savants had neglected to discriminate a particular botanical variety, had failed to describe the seeds or count the sepals. Quote, that is to say, end quote, we replied, quote, the blockheads were not born in Concord, but who said they were? It was their unspeakable misfortune to be born in London or Paris or Rome. But poor fellows, they did what they could, considering that they never saw Bateman's Pond, or 9 Acre Corner, or Becky Stow's Swamp. Besides, what were you sent into the world for but to add this observation? End quote. Had his genius been only contemplative, he had been fitted to his life. But with his energy and practical ability, he seemed born for great enterprise and for command. And I so much regret the loss of his rare powers of action that I cannot help continuing it a fault in him, that he had no ambition, wanting this instead of engineering for all America. He was a captain of a huckleberry party. Pounding beans is good to the end of pounding empires one of these days, but if at the end of years it is still only beans. But these foibles, real or apparent, were fast vanishing in the incessant growth of a spirit so robust and so wise, and which effaced its defects, and which effaced its defeats with new triumphs. His study of nature was a perpetual ornament to him, and inspired his friends with curiosity to see the world through his eyes and to hear his adventures. They possessed every kind of interest. He had many elegancies of his own, whilst he scoffed at conventional elegance. Thus he could not bear to hear the sound of his own steps, the grit of gravel, and therefore never willingly walked in the road, but in the grass, on mountains, and in woods. His senses were acute, and he remarked that by night every dwelling house gives out bad air, like a slaughterhouse. He liked the pure fragrance of melilot. He honored certain plants with special regard, and overall the pond lily, then the gentian, and the mecania, sandins, and, quote, life everlasting, end quote. And a bass tree which he visited every year when it bloomed in the middle of July. He thought the scent a more oracular inquisition than the sight, more oracular and trustworthy. The scent, of course, reveals what is concealed from the other senses. By it he detected earthiness. He delighted in echoes and said they were almost the only kind of kindred voices that he heard. He loved nature so well, was so happy in her solitude, that he became very jealous of cities and the sad work which the refinements and artifices made with man and his dwelling. The axe was always destroying his forests. Quote, thank God, end quote, he said. Quote, they cannot cut down the clouds, end quote. Quote, all kinds of figures are drawn on the blue ground with this fibrous white paint, end quote. I subjoin a few sentences taken from his unpublished manuscripts, not only as records of his thoughts and feeling, but for their power of description and literary excellence. Quote, some circumstantial evidence is very strong, as when you find a trout in the milk, end quote. Quote, the chub is a soft fish and tastes like boiled brown paper, salted, end quote. Quote, the youth gets together his materials to build a bridge to the moon, or perchance a palace or temple on the earth, and at length the middle-aged man concludes to build a woodshed with them, end quote. Quote, the locusts, zing, end quote. Quote, devils, needless zigzagging along the nut meadow brook, end quote. Quote, sugar is not so sweet to the palate as sounds to the healthy ear, end quote. Quote, I put on some hemlock boughs, and the rich salt crackling of their leaves was like mustard to the ear, the crackling of uncountable regiments. Dead tree loves the fire, end quote. Quote, the bluebird carries the sky on his back, end quote. Quote, the teenager flies to the green foliage as if it would ignite the leaves, end quote. Quote, if I wish for a horse here for my compass sight, I must go to the stable, but the hare-bird, with her sharp eyes, goes to the road, end quote. Thoreau. Quote, immortal water, alive even to the superficies, alive even to the superficies, end quote. Quote, fire is the most tolerable third party, end quote. Quote, nature made ferns for pure leaves to show what she could do in that line, end quote. Quote, no tree has so fair a bowl and so handsome an instep as the beech, end quote. Quote, how did these beautiful rainbow tints get into the shell of the fresh water clam, buried in the mud at the bottom of our dark river, end quote. Quote, hard are the times when the infant's shoes are second foot, end quote. Quote, we are strictly confined to our men to whom we give liberty, end quote. Quote, nothing is so much to be feared as fear. Atheism may comparatively be popular with God himself, end quote. Quote, of what intelligence the things you can forget. A little thought is sexton to all the world, end quote. Quote, how can we expect a harvest of thought who have not had a seed time of character, end quote. Quote, only he can be trusted with gifts who can present a face of bronze to expectations, end quote. Quote, I ask to be melted. You can only ask of the metals that they be tender to the fire that melts them. To naught else can they be tender, end quote. There is a flower known to botanists, one of the same genus with our summer plant called, quote, life everlasting, end quote, a gnaphelium, like that which grows on the most inaccessible cliffs of the Tyrolese mountains, where the cameos dare hardly venture, and which the hunter, tempted by his beauty and by his love, for it is immensely valued by the Swiss maidens, climbs the flower in the sand. It is called by botanists the gnaphelium Leontopodium, but by the Swiss Edelweiss, which signifies noble purity. Thoreau seemed to me living in the hope to gather this plant, which belonged to him of right. The scale on which his studies proceeded was so large as to require longevity, and we were the less prepared for his sudden disappearance. The country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost. It seems an injury that he should leave in the midst his broken task, which none else can finish, a kind of indignity to so noble a soul that he should depart out of nature before yet he has been really known to his peers for what he is. But he at least is content. His soul was made for the noblest society. He had in his short life exhausted the capabilities of this world. Wherever there is knowledge, wherever there is virtue, wherever there is beauty, he will find a home. Abraham Lincoln. The 19th of April was the anniversary of the Battle of Concord and Lexington. In 1865, however, it was the day when funeral services were held in Concord for the martyred president. Emerson was one of the speakers in the old meeting house that day. In 1862, Emerson had been taken to the White House to meet Lincoln, who recalled having attended one of Emerson's lectures. Quote, nature, they say, doth dote, and cannot make a man, save on some worn-out plan, repeating us by rote. For him her old world molds aside she threw, and choosing sweet clay from the breast of the unexhausted West, which with stuff untainted, shaped a hero new, wise, steadfast in the strength of God and true. How beautiful to see, once more, a shepherd of mankind indeed, who loved his charge but never loved to lead, one whose meek flock the people joy to be, not lured by any cheat of birth, but by his clear-grained human worth, and brave old wisdom of sincerity. They knew that outward grace is dust, they could not choose but trust, in that sure-footed mind, unfaltering skill, and supple-tempered will, that bent like perfect steel to spring again and thrust. Nothing of Europe here, or then of Europe fronting mornward still. Ere any names of serf and peer, cold nature's equal scheme deface, here was a type of the true elder race, and one of Plutarch's men talked with us face to face. End quote. Lowell Commemoration Ode. Abraham Lincoln. We meet under the gloom of a calamity which darkens down over the minds of good men and all civil society, as the fearful tidings travel over sea, over land, from country to country, like the shadow of an uncalculated eclipse over the planet, old as history is, and manifold as are its tragedies. I doubt if any death has caused so much pain to mankind as this has caused, or caused on its announcement. And this, not so much because nations are by modern arts brought so closely together, as because of the mysterious hopes and fears which in the present day are connected with the name and institutions of America. In this country on Saturday, everyone was struck dumb, and saw at first only deep below deep, as he meditated on the ghastly blow. And perhaps at this hour, when the coffin, which contains the dust of the president, sets forward on its long march through mourning states, on its way to his home in Illinois, we might well be silent and suffer the awful voices of a time to thunder to us. Yes, but that first despair was brief. The man was not so to be warned. He was the most active and hopeful of men, and his work had not perished, but acclamations of praise for the task he had accomplished burst out into a song of triumph, which even tears for his death cannot keep down. The president stood before us as a man of the people. He was thoroughly American, had never crossed the sea, had never been spoiled by the English insularity or French dissipation. A quite native, aboriginal man, as an acorn from the oak. No aping of foreigners, no frivolous accomplishments. Kentuckian born, working on a farm, a flatboatman, a captain in the Black Hawk War, a country lawyer, a representative in the rural legislature of Illinois. On such modest foundations, the broad structure of his fame was laid. How slowly, and yet by happily prepared steps, he came to his place. All of us remember it is only a history of 5 or 6 years. The surprise and the disappointment of the country at his first nomination by the convention at Chicago. Mr. Seward, then in the culmination of his good fame, was a favorite of the Eastern states. And when the new comparatively unknown name of Lincoln was announced, Notwithstanding the report of the acclamations of that convention, we heard the result coldly and sadly. It seemed too rash on a purely local reputation to build so grave a trust in such anxious times, and men naturally talked of the chances in politics as incalculable. But it turned out not to be chance. The profound good opinion which the people of Illinois and of the West had conceived of him, and which they had imparted to their colleagues, that they also might justify themselves to their constituents at home, was not rash, though they did not begin to know the riches of his worth. A plain man of the people, an extraordinary fortune attended him. He offered no shiny qualities at the first encounter. He did not offend by superiority. He had a face and manner which disarmed suspicion, which inspired confidence, which confirmed goodwill. He was a man without vices. He had a strong sense of duty, which it was very easy for him to obey. Then he had what farmers call a long head, was excellent in working out this sum for himself, in arguing his case and convincing you fairly and firmly. Then it turned out that he was a great worker, had prodigious faculty of performance, worked easily, a good worker. It's so rare. Everybody has some disabling quality, and a host of young men that start together and promise so many brilliant leaders for the next age. Each fails in trial, one by bad health, one by conceit, or by love of pleasure, or lethargy, or an ugly temper. Each has some disqualifying fault that throws him out of the career. But this man was sound to the core, cheerful, persistent, all right for labor, and liked nothing so well. Then he had a vast good nature, which made him tolerant and accessible to all, fair-minded, learning to the claim of the petitioner, affable and not sensible to the affliction which the innumerable visits paid for him when president would have brought to anyone else, and how this good nature became a noble humanity. In many a tragic case which the events of the war brought to him, everyone will remember, and with what increasing tenderness he dealt when a whole race was thrown on his compassion. The poor Negro said of him, on an impressive occasion, "Could Massa Lincoln am everywhere." Then his Then his broad good humor, running easily into jocular talk, in which he delighted and in which he excelled, was a rich gift to this wise man. It enabled him to keep his secret, to meet every kind of man in every rank in society, to take off the edge of the severest decisions, to mask his own purpose and sound his companion, and to catch with true instinct the temper of every company he addressed. And more than all, it is to a man of severe labor and anxious and exhausting crisis the natural restorative good of sleep, and is the protection of the overdriven brain against rancor and insanity. He is the author of a multitude of good sayings, so disguised as pleasantries, that it is certain that they had no reputation at first, but as jests, and only later, by the very acceptance and adoption they find in the mouths of millions, turned out to be the wisdom of the hour. I am sure if this man had ruled in a period of less facility of printing, he would have become mythological in a very few years, like Aesop or Pilpay, or one of the 7 wise masters by his fables and proverbs. But the weight and penetration of many passages in his letters, messages, and speeches, hidden now by the very closeness of their application to the moment, are destined hereafter to wide fame. What pregnant definitions, what unerring common sense, what foresight and on great occasion, what lofty and more than national, what humane tone. His brief speech at Gettysburg will not easily be surpassed by words on any recorded occasion. This and one other American speech, that of John Brown to the court that tried him, and a part of the Kossuth speech at Birmingham, can only be compared with each other and with no fourth. His occupying the chair of state was a triumph of the good sense of mankind and of the public conscience. This middle-class country had got a middle-class president at last, yes, in manners and sympathies, but not in powers. for his powers were superior. This man grew according to the need. His mind mastered the problem of the day, and as the problem grew, so did his comprehension of it. Rarely was man so fitted to the event. In the midst of fears and jealousies, in the babble of councils and parties, this man wrought incessantly with all his might and all his honesty, laboring to find what the people wanted and how to obtain that. It cannot be said there is any exaggeration of his worth. If ever a man was fairly tested, he was. There was no lack of resistance, nor of slander, nor of ridicule. The times have allowed no state secrets. The nation has been in such ferment. Such multitudes had to be trusted that no secret could be kept. Every door was ajar, and we knew all that befell. Then, when on occasion, what an occasion was the whirlwind of the war. Here was place for no holiday magistrate, no fair weather sailor. The new pilot was hurried to the helm in a tornado. In 4 years of battle days, his endurance, his fertility of resources, his magnanimity was sorely tried and never found wanting. There, by his courage, his justice, his even temper, his fertile counsel, his humanity, he stood a heroic figure in the center of a heroic epoch. He is the true history of the American people in his time. Step by step he walked before them, slow with their slowness, quickening his march by theirs, the true representative of this continent, an entirely public man, father of his country, the pulse of 20 millions throbbing in his heart, the thought of their minds articulated by his tongue. Adam Smith remarks that the aches which in Halbraken's portraits of British kings and worthies is engraved onto those who have suffered at the block, adds a certain lofty charm to the picture. And who does not see, even in this tragedy so recent, how fast the terror and ruin of the massacre are already burning into glory around the victim? Far happier this fate than to have lived, to be wished away, to have watched the decay of his own faculties, to have seen perhaps even he, the proverbial ingratitude of statesmen, to have seen mean men preferred. Had he not lived long enough to keep the greatest promise that ever man made to his fellow man, the practical abolition of slavery? He had seen Tennessee, Missouri, and Maryland emancipate their slaves. He had seen Savannah, Charleston, and Richmond surrendered. Had seen the main army of the rebellion lay down its arms. He had conquered the public opinion of Canada, England, and France. Only Washington can compare with him in fortune. And what if it should turn out, in the unfolding of the web, that he had reached the term, that this heroic deliverer could no longer serve us, that the rebellion had touched its natural conclusion, and what remained to be done required new and uncommitted hands, a new spirit born out of the ashes of the war, and that heaven, wishing to show the world a completed benefactor, shall make him serve his country even more by his death than by his life. Nations like things are not good by faculty. Nations like things are not good by facility and complacence. Quote, the kindness of kings consists in justice and strength, unquote. Easy good nature has been the dangerous foible of the Republic, and it was necessary that its enemies should outrage it and drive us to unwonted firmness to secure the salvation of this country in the next ages. The ancients believed in a serene and beautiful genius, which ruled in the affairs of nations, which, with a slow but stern justice, carried forward the fortunes of certain chosen houses, weeding out single offenders or offending families and securing at last the firm prosperity of the favorites of heaven. It was too narrow a view of the eternal nemesis. There is a serene providence which rules the fate of nations, which makes little count of time, little of one generation or race, makes no count of disasters, conquers alike by what is called defeat, or by what is called victory, thrust aside enemy and obstruction, crushes everything immoral as inhuman, and obtains the ultimate triumph of the best race by the sacrifice of everything which resists the moral laws of the world. It makes its own instruments, creates the man for the time, trains him in poverty, inspires his genius, and arms him for his task. It has given every race its own talent, and ordains that only that race which combines perfectly with the virtues of all shall endure. Carlyle. Emerson and Carlyle first met in 1833, but neither of them was well known. In spite of grave differences in temperament, they were strongly attached to each other out of natural esteem, which served as spokesmen for the other in England or America. Respectfully, they corresponded frequently all their lives. They met for the second time in 1847 and 1848, when Emerson was lecturing in England. After Carlyle's death, the Massachusetts Historical Society invited Emerson to speak at a meeting in Boston in February 1881. At this time, well on in years and failing mentally, Emerson was unable to prepare an address. But he did read this brief paper, most of which he took from a letter written in 1848 after his second visit with Carlyle. Hold with the maker, not the maid. Sit with the cause, or grim or glad. Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle is an immense talker, as extraordinary in his conversation as in his writing. I think even more so. He is not mainly a scholar like the most of my acquaintances, but a practical Scotchman, such as you would find in any saddler's or iron dealer's shop, and then only accidentally and by a surprising addition that an admirable scholar and writer he is. If you would know precisely how he talks, just suppose youth William, the gardener, had found leisure enough in addition to all his daily work to read Plato and Shakespeare, Augustine and Calvin, and remaining youth William all the time should talk scornfully of all this nonsense of books that he had been bothered with, and you shall have just the tone and talk and laughter of Carlyle. I called him a trip hammer, with, quote, an alien attachment, unquote. He has, too, the strong religious tinge you sometimes find in burly people. That, and all his qualities, have a certain virulence coupled, though it be in his case with the utmost impatience of Christendom and Jewdom, and all existing presentments of the good old story. He talks like a very unhappy man, profoundly solitary, displeased and hindered by all men, and thinks about them, and biding his time, meditating how to undermine and explode the whole world of nonsense which torments him. He is obviously greatly respected by all sorts of people, understands his own value quite as well as Webster, of whom his behavior sometimes reminds me, and can see society on his own terms. And though no mortal in America could pretend to talk with Carlyle, who is also as remarkable in England as the Tower of London, yet neither would he in any manner satisfy us Americans, or begin to answer the questions which we ask. He is a very national figure, and would by no means bear transplantation. They keep Carlyle as a sort of portable cathedral bell, which they like to produce in companies which he is unknown, and set a swinging to the surprise and consternation of all persons, bishops, courtiers, scholars, writers, and as in companies here in England no man is named or introduced. Great is the effect and great the inquiry. Forster of Rodon described to me a dinner at the table d'hote of some provincial hotel, where he carried Carlyle, and where an Irish canoe had uttered something. Carlyle began to talk, first to the waiters and then to the walls, and then lastly unmistakably to the priests in a manner that frightened the whole company. Young men, especially those holding liberal opinions, pressed to see him, but it strikes me like being had to see the mathematical or Greek professor before they have got the lesson. It needs something more than a clean shirt and reading German to visit him. He treats them with contempt. They profess freedom, and he stands for slavery. They praise republics, and he likes the Russian Tsar. They admire Cobden and free trade, and he is a protectionist and political economy. They will eat vegetables and drink water, and he is a Scotchman who drinks English national character, has a pure enthusiasm for beef and mutton, describes with gusto the crowds of people who gaze at the sirloins in the dealer's shop window, and even likes the Scotch nightcap. They praise moral suasion. He goes for murder, money, capital punishment, and other pretty abominations of English law. They wish freedom of the press, and he thinks the first thing he would do, if he got into Parliament, would be to turn out the reporters and stop all manner of mischievous speaking to become and windbags, quote, in the long Parliament, end quote, he says, quote, the only great Parliament, they sat secret and silent, grave as an ecumenical council, and I knew not what they would have done to anybody that had got in there and attempted to tell out of doors what they did, end quote. They go for free institutions, for letting things alone, and only giving opportunity and motive to every man. He for a stringent government that shows people what they must do and makes them do it. Quote here, end quote, he says. Quote, the Parliament gathers up £6 million every year to give to the poor, and yet the people starve. I think if they would give it to me to provide the poor with labor and with an authority to make them work or shoot them, and to be hanged if I did not do it, I could find them in plenty of Indian meal. End quote. He throws himself readily on the other side. If you urge free trade, he remembers that every laborer is a monopolist. The navigation laws of England made his commerce. St. John was insulted by the Dutch. He came home, got the law passed that foreign vessels should pay high fees, and it cut the throat of the Dutch and made the English trade, end quote. If you boast of the growth of the country and show him the wonderful results of the census, he finds nothing so depressing as the sight of a great mob. He saw once, as he told me, 3 or 4 miles of human beings, and fancied that, quote, the earth was some great cheese, and these were mites, end quote. If a Tory takes heart at his hatred of stumpatory and model republics, he replies, quote, yes, the idea of a pig-headed soldier who will obey orders and tire on his own father at the command of his officer is a great comfort to the aristocratic mind, end quote. It is not so much that Carlyle cares for this or that dogma as that he likes geniusness, the source of all strength, in his companions. If a scholar goes into a camp of lumbermen or a gang of tigers, these men will quickly detect any fault of character. Nothing will pass with them but what is real and sound. So this man is a hammer that crushes mediocrity and pretension. He detects weakness on the instant and touches it. He has vivacious, aggressive temperament and unimpressionable. The literary, the fashionable, the political man, each fresh from triumphs in his own sphere, comes eagerly to see this man, whose fun they have heartily enjoyed, sure of a welcome, and are struck with the spear at the first onset. His firm, victorious scoffing, vituperation, I can't really see that word, vituperation, strikes them with chill and hesitation. His talk often permits, that's a hard one to crack, reminds you what was said of Johnson, quote, if his pistol misfire, he would knock you down with the butt end quote. More intellectual partnership wearies him. He detects in an instant if a man stands for any cause to which he is not born, and organically committed, a natural defender of anything, a lover who will live and die for that which he speaks for, and who does not care for him or for anything but his own business he respects. And the nobler this object, of course, the better. He hates a literary trifler. And if, after Guziet had been a tool of Louis Philippi for years, he is now to come and write essays on the character of Washington, on, quote, the beautiful, end quote, and on, quote, philosophy of history, end quote, he thinks that nothing. Great is his reverence for realities, for all such traits as springs from the intrinsic nature of the actor. He humors this into the idolatry of strength. A strong nature has a charm for him. Previous, it would seem, to all inquiry whether the force be divine or diabolic. He preaches as by cannonade the doctrine that every noble nature was made by God and contains, if savage passions, also fit checks and grand impulses, and however extravagant, will keep its orbit and return from far. Nor can that decorum which is the idol of the Englishman, and in attaining which the Englishman exceeds all nations, win from him any obeisance. He is eaten up with indignation against such a desire to make a fair show in flesh, combined with this warfare on respectabilities, and indeed pointing all his satire is the severity of his moral sentiment, in proportion to the peals of laughter amid which he strips the plums of a pretender and shows the lean hypocrisy to every vantage of ridicule. Does he worship whatever enthusiasm, fortitude, love, or other sign of a good nature is in a man? There is nothing deeper in his constitution than his humor, than the considerate, condescending good nature with which he looks at every object in existence, as a man might look at a muse. He feels that the perfection of health is sportiveness, and will not look grave even at dullness or tragedy. His guiding genius is his moral sense, his perception of the soul, importance of truth and justice, but that is a truth of character, not of catechisms. He says, quote, "There's properly no religion in England. These idle nobles at Tattersall's, there is no work or word of serious purpose in them. They have this great lying church, and life is humbug." End quote. He prefers Cambridge to Oxford, but he thinks Oxford and Cambridge education indurates the young men as the stags harden Achilles, so that when they come forth of them, they say, quote, "Now we are proof we have gone through all the degrees, and our case hardened against the veracities of the universe. No man or God can penetrate us," end quote. Wellington he respects as real and honest, and as having made up his mind once for all that he will not have to do with any kind of a lie. Edwin Chadwick is one of his heroes. I can't see the word. To provide every house in London with pure water, 60 gallon to every head at a penny a week, and in their I can't say that word. In the decay and downfall of all religions, Carlyle thinks that the only religion's act which a man nowadays can securely perform is to wash himself well. Of course, the new French Revolution of 1848 was the best thing he had seen, and the teaching this great swindler, Louis Philippi, that there is a God's justice in the universe after all, was a great satisfaction. Tsar Nikolai, I think it's pronounced, was his hero. For in the ignominy of Europe, when all thrones fell like hard homes, and no man was found with conscience enough to fire a gun for him for its crown, but everyone ran away in Cayento, which is with his head shaved through the barrier de Passy. Let's see if you make this. Through the barrier de Passy, one man remained who believed he was put there by God Almighty to govern his empire, and he, by the help of God, had resolved to stand there. He was very serious about the bad times. He had seen this evil coming, but thought it would not come in his time. But now it is coming, and the only good he sees in it is the visible appearance of the gods. He thinks it the only question for wise men, instead of art and fine fancies and poetry and such things, to address themselves to the problems of society. This confusion is the inevitable end of such falsehoods and nonsense as they have been embroiled with. Carlyle has, best of all men in England, kept the manly attitude in his time. He has stood for scholars, asking, I can't say the words, what he should say, holding an honored place in the belief system. He has stood for the people, for the charities, for the, can't say the word, pamphlet maybe? Intrepidly and scornfully teaching the noble their perceptive duties. His errors of opinions are as nothing in comparison with the merit in my judgment. The plump cannot be mimicked. It is the speaking to the heart of the thing. And in England, with a morgue of aristocracy, has very slowly admitted scholars into society. The morgue of aristocracy has very slowly admitted scholars into society. A very few houses, only in the high circles, being ever open to them. He has carried himself erect, made himself a power confessed by all men, and taught scholars the lofty duty he never feared the face of man. I think we're done. That is the end of this 909-page book. The end of the book was not very discernible. Is that the right word? Yeah, I couldn't really make out the words, but we got there in the end. I think we figured out the gist of it. What do you think of my style of reading? What do you think about the messages Waldo Emerson shares in this collection of amazing essays? It does get quite political towards the end. Kind of divisive also. Not really my style. I don't believe in division and divisiveness. That's not my style. I believe everyone's beautiful, everyone's lovely. But this is his style. He does share great insights. Indeed, he does encourage people to believe in their virtues, and he inspires people to empower themselves and to learn from nature, learn from the resilience in nature, about courage, about tenacity, about boldness, strength, and godliness, which we all carry within us. Towards the end, he shares insights and conversations he had with Lincoln and his own eulogy of Lincoln, of Abraham Lincoln. A unique individual in his own right, an amazing person who was the president of America. Coming up soon to 200 years ago. Okay, we're still pretty far. We're in 2024, but over 150 years ago, and he has left an indelible mark on society which will never be forgotten. He was an amazing person. Lincoln, he was middle class. He was not looking for fame and glory. He also talks about Webster, whom he found to be uncanny and not to be trusted in the end. And David Thoreau as well. He found interesting insights on him. I found that also to be fascinating to hear his opinion on David Thoreau, whom he had a bittersweet relationship with. Yeah, and Carlyle was the last character. He was speaking of his accompanyship, his company which he had with him. What are your thoughts? What are your insights? What are your what are the lessons you got from this book, and what do you think of my style of reading? Do you resonate with it? Could you listen to this audiobook when you're doing other things? Does that work for you? I want to hear all about it. Please share your thoughts, your feedback, your insights, your comments in the comment section down below. And please smash the like or dislike button. That's very much appreciated. And why not subscribe if you haven't already? It helps me get these messages out further and further and further, and more people gain, and we all gain as a result. It doesn't take more than 2 seconds literally to press a like or dislike button, which effectively makes this video go further. So why not do a kind deed and share that like or dislike by pressing on the button? That's what you gotta do. I look forward to hearing from you. Enjoy your lovely day. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me as I read this amazing book. Please share insights. Subscribe if you haven't already. I look forward to hearing from you. Love you. Keep on shining your beautiful light.